Welcome to Grub and Grace. We're not all heroes wear crepes. I am Mark Flower, and I will be having a conversation with my revered guest, Mike Maeshiro. We will be discussing how we can make room and safe spaces for those who are carrying religious trauma, to grieve properly, and how to allow ourselves to get out of our own echo chambers to hear other voices. I learned a lot from this conversation, and my hope for you is that you'll be able to take something away as well. So, take along as we dig in. Welcome to Grub and Grace. I am Mark Flower. I am here with my revered guest, Mike Maeshiro, and I hope I'm pronouncing that right.
You are actually.
All right, cool.
Bravo.
Cool. Right on. I looked up some videos, so I was hoping that I would get that correct on the first try. Mike Maeshiro is the founder of Numa, an organization that supports people recovering from religious toxicity. Mike is gay, an advocate for the LGBTQ plus community, and a queer theology enthusiast. Mike is a former instructor at Bethel School of Supernatural Ministry, best known for his class, Discerning of Spirits. He now teaches in emotional health and redemptive deconstruction. He is a consultant and coach for gay men recovering from evangelicalism. He also has a team of coaches who work with people whose faith is evolving. He is a social media influencer and thought leader. Mike loves Japanese food, movies, and playing volleyball, and has a depth of useless knowledge about the X-Men, which I love that. Anything comics. I mean, so part of this podcast, I want to dig deep into some more of the nerdy topics, like comics, movies, all that kind of stuff. Even just like books. So there's one book I'm going to be talking with. Do you know Geek or Systematic Geekology podcast?
No.
They're friends with like Trip Fuller. They're over on the East Coast over there, but I got to meet Will and some of the guys over there, and I was talking about this book, and they're like, "We should have you on for like a Christmas episode. That would be amazing." So I love all this like nerdy stuff that it just it just brings so much joy in like kind of a dark, dull world.
Yeah, totally. Love that. That's awesome.
Let's see. Did I miss anything? I mean, that's quite a full resume.
No, it's a very long intro, and you nailed all of it. It's too long, but yeah.
I was hoping I'd be able to say things like evangelicalism because I went to school at Evangel, but I was hoping at least I'd get that word down just because it's been part of my life for so long.
Right. Totally. Mark, thanks for having me on. I'm honored to be here.
Yeah, I'm really glad you're here. I've just been looking forward to this for so long. Let's jump into it then. I sent you the questions before. I'm sure you were able to look over them. I mean, I base these questions off of what you do, and it's best to my knowledge, based on off of your website and what I know of you from social media. So I'll just jump into it. So can you explain what religious harm and trauma is and how it manifests in individuals?
Yes, I mean, it's kind of a big question because firstly, I want to say it manifests in lots of different ways, right? People experience trauma in lots of unique, specific paths in their minds, right? And their bodies. So the loose umbrella explanation I would give is basically for many of us who've experienced religious trauma, we were raised in very indoctrinated spaces, typically in an evangelical church, where we were taught at ages that we were too young to be able to even critically think through what we were being told. Pretty awful things about the world, God, people, ourselves, especially if you're queer. But even if you were straight, there's still so much about evangelical theology that is terrifying, that is dehumanizing, that is, fostering a sense of self-hatred and low self-worth. And so when you actually metabolize the beliefs and there's so many that we could list, right? Just hell, sin, Jesus dying on the cross for your sins because you are unworthy of God's love. There are just so many things we could look at that, if you actually ingest this and believe it and practice it and internalize it, it starts to produce a lot of really negative effects in your life and in your body. And so that shows up in lots of different ways for people, but ultimately it's, you are stunted at being able to flourish and thrive as an adult, as a full-fledged person, because these beliefs have limited your capacity to consider otherwise, and have, arrested your energies and attention on things that in a lot of ways aren't even real, and then have prevented you from being able to apply yourself in other ways, being open to and like considerate of things that would cause you to grow and nourish you. Anyway, so this is actually not a short answer, but like, it's like that, you know what I mean? And it just goes in so many directions and has so many layers of impact. And we all have our different ways that we've coped, those of us who have at least survived and left the institution. But anyway, I'll stop talking. That's my answer.
No, I actually really like that. And maybe to further expand on that, like, what are some common experiences that kind of manifest some of these traumas? I know you kind of went over it a little bit with that answer. But.
Yeah, well, maybe I'll try and speak from my own experience. Mine is very obviously specifically more toward the queer journey, but as a gay man in evangelicalism, some of the cognitive like fallout that I had to live was the cognitive dissonance of constantly trying to reinforce a narrative and an experience that wasn't mine, and trying to somehow alter or change, deny, fantasize about an experience that I actually wasn't having in order to meet up to the standards that were being imposed on me from everyone all around me. And of course the theology. So like that in and of itself is draining. It's exhausting, right? It just requires a lot of energy. It's unfulfilling. It creates this like rift within yourself. My ability to trust myself was like ruptured for a long time. Like I couldn't trust that what I experienced, what I felt, what I wanted was like valid, right? And that's like a really debilitating place to live from, especially when it's like touching something as deep and as profound as how you give and receive love, and experience intimacy. So for me, it was a lot of like lying to myself and everyone else, and then not being able to be clear about what I even am experiencing and what's true about me. I remember there were a few years there where I was like, I might be straight. Like I genuinely wondered if I could be straight, like that I wasn't gay, because I was so sexually repressed that the lack of mess ups made me think maybe my sexuality was changing. Maybe I was becoming less gay, and maybe that meant I was actually then leaning more toward being straight, which was of course not true. I was repressed. And so anyway, like for me, that was a very specific and distinct like cognitive experience of this religious trauma. It made me very afraid of the leaders in my life, which is strange because I was also a leader in that world, and I was very celebrated and had, a platform, and was just enjoyed a lot of privilege and like favor is what they would have called it, right? And promotion in the spaces that I was in. And all the while I was doing all of that with a noose around my neck. And so I just constantly was ready for the ball to drop, the hammer to drop. I don't know, something was supposed to drop on me, right? Which eventually it did, right? Thankfully it was a choice I made, but that was constantly just like looming over me. So any kind of choice I made in the public space just like inched the threat closer to me, right? And that's just like really unhealthy to be living under, the constant threat of everything's going to be taken away from you. You're going to be rejected and outcast from, the world that you know. Anyway, it's a lot of that. I can go into a lot more details, but that's the gist.
Right on. No, like hearing your story online on, like I looked it up on YouTube, your coming out story. Like a lot of what you said is just, it was so good to hear, so refreshing to hear this other narrative. Like me growing up in a primarily Christian community, you don't necessarily hear too many stories like yours. And I'm just really glad that, you have come out and been very vocal about your story and about others people's struggles. Like even listening to your story, there's a couple things that I felt like I kind of resonated with in certain ways. Like you had mentioned that you never really got along with the other boys too much. You felt like you connected more with the other girls, which I feel like I can kind of resonate a little with that. Like I noticed at kind of younger age that there was a lot of like grandstanding, their masculinity, and primarily my male friends within the church were very this is how you need to be masculine. And then you get like the Super Bowl or football season, and it's almost like watching football and knowing how to talk about football became this model for how to become a man. And everything else kind of rotated around that. And I just kind of saw this hypocrisy along with everything with that. And I just didn't feel like I could really connect with a lot of my other male friends just because I wasn't into that myself. And I felt like I actually connected a lot with my my female friends a lot more because of that. I felt like there was just more that I could actually talk to about. That having been said, like, I don't have the same story as you. I am a white heterosexual male. There were times in my life where I actually was trying to be honest with myself and asking, like, am I gay? Like, and nothing ever came of it. I never had any feelings toward anyone of the same sex. But I at least, was able to be open to a realization of that, where I think a lot of people that are in the heterosexual lifestyle might be masking it and hiding it and burying it down as deep as they can. And I do have a lot of friends, or at least some friends, that I feel like that is the case, and it's kind of tough to see.
Yeah, totally. Very tough, for sure.
Sorry, I just like, I'm interviewing you and I'm like, talking way too much, but I just really wanted to share that.
Yeah, totally. Thanks for sharing it.
Here, I'll go on to the next one here. How can we create spaces that allow for the voices of those who have been victimized by the church and religious organizations to be heard?
That's a good question. Listen, my answer, the first thing that comes up for me, I don't even want to say it because I feel like it's difficult to hear, and it's because it requires work. But I think this is like probably more important than some of the things that would come later. If we want to create space and platform voices of people who are, within marginalized communities, I think that one of the most important things you can do, whoever I'm talking to, if you're somebody who's enjoying privilege, right, and you have access to space that, could amplify these other experiences and their voices, I think one of the most important things you can do is to start doing the work yourself of becoming aware of your own privilege, of the ways that you are currently benefiting from systems that you might not be conscious of, that favor and prioritize people who look and sound and come from places that you do. Become aware of that. Do the work, go through the process of grief, because I think any ethical, moral person who actually starts waking up to the landscape and what's been going on for a long time and it's still happening, the victims that this creates, the oppression that's still actively happening in the world today, I think that there's a necessary grieving process, where you get to acknowledge the harm that's been done, that, a lot of us have been complicit with unknowingly a lot of times. And just letting that pierce our souls, as humans, and just recognizing this should never have happened, let alone it definitely shouldn't still be happening. And so I necessarily have to get in the way of this stuff because I'm aware of it now, because I see it. So I think that awareness piece is so important. I don't think giving people the, A plus B equals C, do this is helpful until that internal work is done. When that conscience piece comes into play and the empathy kicks in and the human being can actually identify with what that might be like, as much as their imagination and capacity for empathy can take them to, have that experience first. I think we need to be pierced, I think is the word I would use, right? Because there's all of this, we have all these protections in place to help us just survive and get through society, right? That may or may not even be relevant to this conversation right away, but those protections harden us and, keep us insulated and allow us to keep moving forward without getting just utterly obliterated by everything that's wrong with the world. And so some of that needs to be penetrated. We have to get past some of those walls that we've built up in ourselves to survive in order to recognize that some other people are actually in such worse positions and are in worse identities in our culture based on how society treats them. So I think that awareness is key, is essential. Become aware, become informed, wake up and realize what has been and is still going on, be affected by that, right? Let that change what you see, how you feel, what you're aware of, right? And then as that has its own effect in you, then you get to get more practical. And then you start looking at I would look at my social media. Am I following a bunch of straight white people? If so, why is that, right? Maybe I should interrogate that a little bit and not defend myself. Hopefully some of that work has like gotten us to a place where we are emotionally resilient and ethically like accountable to recognizing like I have some spots here that I maybe can't see. And so I'm going to take responsibility for that. And I'm going to do like an inventory check. Like if 90% of the people that I follow on social media, that I platform, that I listen to are straight white people, like maybe that says something and I need to do something about that. So then a solution to that could be actively to go start finding voices that don't fit that mold. So go listen to queer people, go listen to people of color, go listen to Black women, right? Like go find other voices that are saying something very different from anything you've ever experienced before, and lean in and let them upset you, let them offend you, let them freak you out, let them make you really angry, let them make you feel misunderstood, mischaracterized, right? And then instead of like attacking or getting mad at the person who's provoking that within you, interrogate that experience. Okay, what are you afraid of? Why are you angry? Why are you getting defensive here? Do they have a point? Is there something valid here that you need to look at, right? And then lean into that growth. So if we're itemizing this, 1, do the internal work. 2, check yourself in terms of like who you're still actively like subscribing to, right? Like giving access to like influencing you. And then 3, if you have any, whatever kind of sphere of influence you possess, start pulling people other than, you know, the privileged world that you're part of, like into that space. Like you build connections with people who are different from you, get to know them, right? Get to hear their stories and experience them as people, and then like invite them into your space. And, you know, like, so I guess in this context, Mark, like doing what you're doing, right? Like you're having this gay guy get in here to talk about, you know, all this stuff. Like, I feel like it's like that, right? Like whatever ways that we have avenues of impacting our environment, like let's use the platforms and the privilege that we're enjoying, and let's like share that with people who don't have access to that, who can't work hard enough to get that. Let's start like pulling them into it and letting them like have an effect, you know?
Can I just applaud everything? It's like that's, I mean, just like you said, this is what I'm doing with my podcast. This is the whole idea with this podcast, is the best conversation comes with sitting around a table around food. And what comes with food is healing and reconciliation, because so I just recently had a talk with Andrew Camp from the Biggest Table podcast, but we were talking about with the holidays coming up, how can we navigate some of these tough and difficult conversations? And whereas these holidays can be really difficult with having these discussions with people, the table itself, around food, it's almost like the food distracts you from the heart of the conversation, from like these heated emotions, and allows you to focus more on your food, so that when you're talking with people around the table, you can kind of try to navigate that a little bit more safely. And, you know, there's a lot more complexity and nuance to it, but you really need to broaden your scope and bring people on so that you can have different voices and have different perspectives. It's just so important with life and getting a nice like overall picture of everything, so that you're not stuck in your bubble, you're not stuck in your own little spaces. You get out in the world and you experience it, and you experience people, you experience, you know, the love that people can give you and that you can give them as well. So I just think it's so beautiful how you phrased everything. I just love it.
Thanks. Yeah, agreed. Yeah, all that, we love it.
Okay, and let's see. In your experience, what are some of the long-term effects of spiritual or religious trauma on individuals, and how does it affect their relationships, mental health, and spiritual beliefs moving forward? I know you've seen a lot of this because you actually have some healing groups that you do, so I kind of want to hear your response.
Healing groups, nice. Yeah, totally. So long-term effects of this stuff on people. Let's start with relationships, because that's a pretty big one. So in evangelicalism, you're not just taught theology, right? Of course, that's a big part of it. But what comes with that is a hierarchy, right? Like you are invited into, invite is the wrong word. You are trained, I'm going to use this word, I'm not being dramatic. You are literally indoctrinated into a hierarchical structure that centers and prioritizes typically the pastor, right? And the pastor is typically, literally every church I was ever a part of before I walked away, the pastor was a straight white, a cisgender man. So that says something, right? Like every spiritual authority figure at every church I was ever a part of. And that's not true for every evangelical church, but it was true for a lot of them, right? And every single one that I had been part of, that's what we saw as the example, the ideal. And there's a lot of messaging that's being given out there that's subconscious and cultural, right? But it is like reinforced. And so anyway, when you have that conditioning, and then as a queer person, you know that that position is a threat to your humanity, that if they found out about you, you're out. You're going to be seen as a heathen, a sinner, a devil worshiper, or, someone who's not going to inherit the kingdom, like whatever. That's terrifying, right? So I mean, I've met so many gay people after I came out who were raised in the church, who have walked away, who have zero interest in going back. They still consider themselves Christian in terms of like a label, right? As far as like their beliefs are concerned, but they would never go back to a church. They don't read the Bible anymore. They don't even pray because they feel like the iteration of Christianity they knew that was the only form of spirituality they were ever taught to practice. It was taken from them because they no longer fit the mold of the evangelical church they were raised in. And so they just become orphaned. They become like disenfranchised spiritual vagabonds, right? And so they're out. Then they instead just give themselves to whatever else they can find that fills a deep longing for meaning and connection. And so to me, like that's one very specific like pipeline of the effect that religious trauma. I'm not sure what the umbrella question right now is anymore, but that has that effect on gay people especially. And so there's that, but then let's step outside of the queer experience and just like the people that I work with and that I interact with on a regular basis, just around the theology and deconstructing. I mean, women are so negatively impacted by evangelical theology, right? Like the patriarchy that's just so pervasive in that, purity culture especially targets women, dehumanizes women, like separates them from their own bodies. And it just, there's so many harmful messages around like your body. I mean, the truth is everybody in evangelicalism is taught that your body doesn't belong to you, but that especially has like practical consequence on women, right? Because when it's in a patriarchal structure, maybe our bodies don't belong to us, any of us, but when you are a woman and you marry a man, all of a sudden the man is the head of the household. So maybe neither of your bodies belong to you, but he has authority over what's decided in that space. Anyway, so there's a huge discrepancy between how this kind of thinking and belief system affects people of different genders, right? And then of course, when it comes to the purity culture side, it dramatically impacts our relationship with our sexuality, not just your sexual orientation, but also your sex drive, your sexual appetite, your sexual expression, your sexual desire, your sexual education, right? Like so much of that is distorted, denied, avoided, kept from you. There's this weird secret that's like enshrouded with like the threat of sin and depravity and deception. That's also an intrinsic part of your humanity. And it only gets to be acceptable when you enter a cisgender, heterosexual, monogamous marriage. And so that obviously has its effect in so many ways. I mean, so many people have been devastated by purity culture. I'm still unpacking some of the effects that had on me because I was in it for 30-ish years, right? I've walked away. It doesn't just turn off. You know what I mean? I still have to like do work at recognizing ways that I'm still repressing myself, ways that I still fear sexual interaction because of, the threats that always came from the purity culture side of this. And then of course there's the whole psychological torment of like, you're going to go to hell if you don't fill in the blank. And then there's all these contradictions in I'm sorry, I'm just going to, Mark, stop me when we're good because I could keep going and going. Maybe I'll land the plane on this one. Maybe two more. Okay. The hell thing, like
go for it.
There's all of this contradicting ideology within evangelical theology that says like, you're going to hell if you don't accept Jesus into your heart. And you can only be saved through the grace of God, right? By accepting the sacrifice of Jesus. But also, they don't say this explicitly, but it is absolutely reinforced and practiced in the culture. Accepting Jesus into your heart is not enough. You have to go to church. You have to tithe. You have to not cuss. You have to not have sex outside of marriage. You have to not cheat on your spouse. There's a lot of other things you have to do in order to remain acceptable within the community, which then your, salvation gets conflated with that. So if your church community rejects you, then now obviously, of course, you're going to hell, you're deceived, right? And that's like very, very damaging to people's psyches. You know what I mean? Like, so many people have been dejected from their church communities, and it has ravaged their lives. It has so like deteriorated their like willingness to trust people, to belong to organized religion again, to open the Bible, to hear the name Jesus, to hear somebody talk about God said to me, or it's God's will. Like, that phraseology, there's so much Christianese. It just is cringy and is actually a trigger for a lot of us because of how people who speak like that treated us. And like all of the coded messaging that was not honest or clear or forthright, that there were absolutely protocols and like, there's a word I can't think of it. There are protocols that you had to follow, and that, you know, some of them were told to you, you thought, but then other ones were not told to you, or you didn't understand them correctly, or you practiced your freedom, or you didn't adhere to the restrictions in the right way. And the consequence was all consuming and immediate. And you didn't realize it was going to be, you know, but then you see other people who did things that you thought were probably worse. And for some reason, they're actually like getting promoted in the same space. It like is a mind job, right? So the hell is like this giant club just being held over people to get them to comply. The last thing I want to throw in here is like, also, by the way, I don't want to say this because it's like not fun, but the notion that you need to die and Jesus needs to replace you, I at this point now actually find to be incredibly toxic, which is so ironic because when I was a teacher and a preacher, like that was the message, right? And it was such a beautiful, hopeful, redemptive, life-giving message. And now I look at this thing outside of the system and I'm like, this idea is so damaging, because what's built into that idea of like, you know, Christ in you, the hope of glory, you die, Jesus shows up, Jesus takes over, Jesus replaces you. That idea in and of itself carries an inherent message that you're bad. Your uniqueness, your identity, the things that uniquely like culminate the person we think you are bad. And the goal here is to eradicate who you are and to replace you with, we'll use the name Jesus, but actually what we're doing in evangelical spaces is we're trying to replace you with a straight white Christian man. We want you to be more like that. And we're going to continue to prop up example after example of what you're supposed to look like and be like and value and protect. And when you continue to just fail to be this, it's because of sin, you know? It's because there's something wrong with you. And then so Jesus is weaponized. The theology in and of itself, I'm like, this has been such a predatory, toxic parasite that has ruined people's lives. I'm not trying to be dramatic. Anyway, I'll stop there. Mark, I could keep going. There are so many things like this, but anyway.
Oh, I know you could. I've heard you, talking about this stuff on social media, and I've listened to your videos. So I know very well that you could go on, and I if we had all the time in the world, I would just let you go on for an entire day. So, and I would post everything about it. So, but it's everything you're saying. People wonder why deconstruction is such a big thing right now. People wonder why people are leaving the church. I mean, if you look at the PRRI, I think it's the Public Research of Something Institute. They came out with results last year. So earlier this year, they came out with results from 2023, from a decade before. So that whole decade span, they found that right now, from last year, church attendance from people who go to at least one service or one thing in a church a week is down to 24% of all Americans go, which is down 7% from a decade ago, which is pretty massive. And, for everything that you said, you can see why people are doing that. And this is basically the stats of people that have left the church altogether. They've become either non-believers or agnostics or atheists, or whatever category you want to put in. That doesn't account for people deconstructing and leaving the church, like you were talking about, where they still consider themselves Christian, and but they're just not actually going to an active church. So that could even be way lower than what those stats are even saying. So I'm just kind of baffled by people that are in the church, that this cognitive dissonance, like you said earlier, that it's like the statistics are out there. People are talking about this in abundance right now, and yet people are still deciding to close their ears and not want to listen to it because it doesn't fit into their mold of what they think a Christian should be. And it's infuriating. It's frustrating to So,
yeah. And it's so sad. It's so sad. I mean, it's something we get angry about. And then, but when you listen to the victims of this regularly, you just like hear story after story after story of how people's lives have just specifically been ravaged by this stuff. It's so sad. And then to watch the people who are still perpetuating these things and the arrogance and the entitlement and the just void of compassion or awareness is just, it's unbelievable. Anyway. Yeah.
Yeah. And I just got to say one last thing, like, you know, even though it's infuriating and frustrating sometimes to have to explain things over and over again, or try to even get another perspective out there, a lot of my friends are open to listening. And I think that's where you got to show a lot of grace too, because there are people that just don't know any better, and maybe they just don't, like, genuinely don't know another way than what they've been living. And even if you have to tell them, you know, over and over again, and they just are very, you know, hard-headed about it, you know, give it a little time, be patient, give them grace to be able to hear you out. And, you know, in time, I mean, you've seen how many people are deconstructing now. Like April Joy, I mean, she's very vocal now, but she was deep into it. I mean, she even sang it on the Jim Bakker show. So she created a original song for the Jim Bakker show. So, I mean, you see where people were and where they came from. You know that there can be hope in the end. So it's easy to talk about the frustrations, but it's almost like you still have to kind of remember and remind yourself, you know, we were all there once, so who have experienced religious trauma. Did I already ask you that?
No.
No? Okay, yeah. How can we ensure that those who have experienced religious trauma feel supported and empowered?
Yeah. Okay. So I'm gonna be really practical, Mark. So like, for example, the thing we were just talking about, telling people to be patient with the evangelical bigots in their lives, because look at where we were at one point, right? Like, I understand logically where that's coming from, and there's truth to it, right? That's true. We're using April Joy as an example. She was so deep into Christian nationalism and, you know, like up there writing music and performing live unto this whole psychotic empire. I was in the same boat in my own way, right? In terms of like being a poster child for charismatic Christianity and the things that I used to say publicly and that I was known for and whatever. And so, right, look at us, right? We were those people. And now look at us, look at what we're doing in the world and what we believe and what we're advocating for, you know? So totally, there's truth to that. However, and I'll say this as a gay person who was coming out of the closet, I had a lot of people when I was on my way when I was coming out, people were telling me like, hey, be patient with these people who don't see you as a valid human right now, because you used to believe these things. And I would say, in terms of being a marginalized person in that process, people saying that to me was not helpful. That actually made me feel...
I just said that earlier, so I'm sorry.
No, it's great. But that's what I'm using that as an example to be like, when it comes to people who've been traumatized by this stuff and are currently actively trying to work through that, while there might be truth to, hey, you know, these people can and possibly could change. We know people have changed. There's truth to that. That doesn't mean the people they're dealing with are going to change. Because we know a lot of people who never changed, who don't, unfortunately, and I'm not trying to emphasize the negative side of this, because there is hope and there are people who will change, and that's awesome. And we love that. But we don't know that it's going to be their people. And so giving them false hope, and we actually have no educated information around their context and the people they're talking about, that those people possibly could change. We don't know that. And even if they do change a year from now, 5 years from now, that doesn't change the impact those people's beliefs and practices right now are having on them in real time. And so for me, when I was in that position and people were telling me like, hey, be patient, you know, they're not going to change overnight. While there might be some form of truth to that response, ultimately what I was experiencing on an emotional level was, hey, what you're feeling isn't valid. And that's not what they were trying to say to me, but that's what I was hearing and experiencing as a traumatized individual trying to get out of the traumatizing contexts that I was in, right? So I would advise, when it comes to this context of like, how do we create safe space for people? I'm like, we probably should be really aware of how the things we say and then our rush to try and mitigate the harm we think people are going through, and we naturally just want to help. Let's interrogate the things we think are helpful and recognize that maybe that might have been helpful for me, but I'm not this kind of a person in the world. It might not be helpful for them. And so then getting really clear from people in those spaces, like what is helpful, right? And that, I think in order for us to learn those things, we're gonna have to lean in and really listen. I had to learn that. Like I don't know. I was gonna say I might have said something like that to someone else coming out, but I'm like, I don't think I would have actually, because I was living it out, right? Like because I had the experience. But like, for example, I'm not a trans person, and I have such compassion and empathy for the trans community and everything that they're having to like continue to fight through even now. I've done a lot of listening, and a lot of the things that guide and clarify and motivate me in terms of how I participate and show up in my attempts to be an ally to the trans community is things that I've learned from trans people, from listening, and not to people who have opinions about trans people, right? Like those are two different kinds of sources, right? And so I think just getting really clear about how our responses, how our advice, how our quote unquote support is actually like experienced by the marginalized people that we're giving this to, we need to do some work on just like getting a more filled out picture of how some of that translates to people who aren't us, who aren't privileged in the ways that we are, you know? Cause like I'd say stuff to people who are in like more disenfranchised positions than I'm in, and it can totally come across the same way. And I don't want to have that kind of an effect on them. So part of my answer, like another example would be like, I've got a friend who's a gay. Okay. I want to just try and keep this as anonymous as possible. I've got a friend who works at a church and he's gay. And this last week we had a really shock at the recording of this. Trump was elected. This is their next president, right? And the pastor of this church, who's a straight man, was basically like trying to give hope to his congregation and like, hoorah for what we're going to do to move forward and whatever. And my friend, who's a gay person working there, was like, I don't want to hoorah. I don't want to jump into the next thing we're going to do. I'm not ready for that. Right. And so, he sent me this long text, just like what he would want to say to this person instead. And ultimately the heart cry. And I'm like, yeah, totally. That's exactly how I'd feel. He was like, I don't want to jump into the next thing. I want to hear, this isn't okay. This is awful. This should not have happened. This must be devastating. We don't just hurry past this. We need to validate and acknowledge the impact this has on people, that this affects greater than other people, right? And the solution is not, let's pretend like it's not happening or let's hurry to a solution. The proper response to this is to not find a solution, is instead to sit with the people who are mourning and mourn with them, right? I mean, this is a biblical precedent, right? Like, mourn with those who mourn. Don't give them some like cheesy solution so you don't have to deal with the discomfort that comes from having to live in a world that targets and dehumanizes whole people groups, right? Like, anyway, so there's a lot there to learn. And so to me, ultimately the priority in terms of if we're going to create safe space for people who are navigating marginalized identities, we got to listen to them. We've got to like lean in and let them tell us how they experience our solutions. And if our solutions are actually not helpful for them, then we need to relabel those solutions as something else. And we need to recognize that those solutions belong in other spaces, not this one, right? And so like there's a cultural difference when a straight person shows up in a queer space. They're a guest, and guests have a different kind of demeanor and audacity in some ways than someone who's part of the culture, right? And so a guest should be showing up with some humility and like being slow to speak, quick to listen, right? And like considerate of what is being communicated and what is being expressed. And then from there, I think then that changes how we go about processing and then responding to people in these places. So it's work, right? Like I probably would not have I could not have said to you like, hey, Mark, I don't think it's helpful to say that some people will change, to give them space and patience. Like, yeah, I don't think that's helpful. I won't say that to people now. Like I've got a lot of people who are deconstructing who come to me. I would never say that to them because they don't need that. That's not helpful. What they're looking for emotionally, whether they know to ask for it or not, ultimately is, please tell me I'm not alone. Please tell me I'm not the only one. Please tell me that this isn't just happening to me, right? Because we're looking for encouragement and hope, not, someone else's idea of what a solution looks like so I don't have to feel it anymore, because the feelings don't just go away, right? Anyway, so to me, that's like a big one. And I had to like spend a lot of time and energy to learn, because I used to be an evangelical leader. I used to be a pastor, right? Like I used to have all the answers for everyone all the time. I wasn't allowed to say I don't know. So learning how to say that to people in like theological or spiritual conversations was a big pill to swallow for me. And it was work. And I finally got to a place where I started like becoming comfortable with acknowledging like, I don't know everything. I know this might be a shock to you guys, but I don't know everything. Right. But I had to start doing that to just be ethical in those conversations and like have the appropriate accountability. Right. And it's also been so liberating, because I was part of a hierarchical structure and I was like performing my role to keep this structure in place. And the structure is actually harming a lot of people, including me. So I'm so glad I walked away from it. I'm glad I finally was able to undo those things. And actually, people don't need me to have all the answers. They need the people around them to witness them, you know, to like validate and understand and like hold space for what they're experiencing. It doesn't have to be correct. It doesn't have to be accurate. And so you can tell when the privileged person is entering the conversation, when they're starting to try and tell people and police what they're allowed to say or what they're allowed to conclude or how they're allowed to move forward. It's like, oh, you don't understand how to grieve. You actually don't recognize, you know, and it just kind of comes off as like, maybe like a shallow emotional development in the person. I have a lot of straight evangelicals in my world that I've since distanced myself from, who used to exhibit a lot of that. A lot of their responses to grief and pain and injustice were like, shh, but this is true. Therefore you can't feel that way. Mm-hmm. And it's just so infuriating and painful to be met that way. So I guess my answer, I mean, there's so many answers, but my ultimate one is like letting the listening be so significant that it legitimately changes the way that we think, the way that we hear, and then it changes the way that we participate, you know, like that it would like clean up our phrases. Like I don't say you guys anymore because not everyone is a guy or identifies as male. Right. And I know that culturally, colloquially, there's, you know, like a glazing over, but some people are actually sensitive to gendered terms. And so I'm actually trying to de-gender when I address a group of people. That's work. I don't have to do it, but it's changing because I've listened to people who are trans and non-binary, and the gender language actually impacts them in a way that I don't have to think about, you know? I don't say blind spot anymore because that's an ableist term associating someone who's blind with someone who's an idiot. And like that conflation is not appropriate. So I'm like, okay. And so it's work, right? But like my listening has gotten significant enough that it's changing the way that I'm participating. And I'm like, that practice to me has probably been one of the most helpful, that set me up for success in being able to show up for other marginalized people. So I don't know if that's practical. I think it's practical, right? But like, then that would impact or filter how we follow through with lots of other things too. You know what I mean? I feel like I've gotten in the weeds on this.
No, please. I still struggle with a lot of the, like that last part you're talking about with like saying you guys anymore. I just did that like a few days ago, and it was to three women, and I said, see you guys later. And after I walked away, I was like, was there something better at how I could have phrased that? I could have said, see you all later or something like that. You know, they may not have been impacted the way you were talking about, but how would I know that, you know, without having a conversation with them? So it's those things that like I'm still trying to figure out as I'm going too. You know, you're saying all this and I'm like, yes. And, you know, there's things that I do that like little scenarios will bring up an old habit or way of thinking about doing something or acting. And I'll do it that way, but then I'll realize, no, that like I need to kind of decolonize that thought process. I need to kind of, you know, destruct that thought process and rethink about how I could do that better and how I could act better the next time I come across something like this. And it's this thing that I'm constantly going through. Even some of the ingrained racism that I grew up with. Not that my parents were, I wouldn't consider my parents racist, and I still don't, but there is this kind of culture that they grew up in that they brought along with them subconsciously that impacted or has reflected onto my life. And I'm in the process of trying to decolonize a lot of that ingrained kind of racism that has been passed down. So, and sexism, you know, homophobia, that sort of thing. So, I'm right with you. I like you're talking. I'm just like, yes. You know, it's a constant learning process, and it's nice that you were saying like it's nice to be heard and to be understood that, we're all on this journey together, because it can be very lonely trying to figure all this stuff out.
For sure.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I'll jump into this last one here. What resources or approaches do you recommend for individuals seeking to heal from religious trauma? And how can advocates help guide people toward recovery and the freedom to redefine their spiritual journeys?
Okay, you know what? It is not my fault that my answers are long-winded. These are very layered questions. This is your fault, not mine.
I got to thank ChatGPT for this.
Yeah, totally.
It helped me out with this.
Nice. God, I think my answer might be a little outdated for some people, but I do think, depending on your level of engagement with the theology that you're coming out of, to me, the reading is necessary. I don't know that listening and watching is enough. You've got to take time and process through the jot and the tittle that got you. Jot and tittle? That's so, anyway, that got you to where you were theologically to begin with, right? You didn't just wake up one day and you were indoctrinated. That was years. That was day after week, after hour, after month, after year, after Sunday school class, after youth group, after church service, after sermon, after retreat, after camp, right? You had all of this stuff investing in you thinking in a very specific way and not thinking any other way. That's not just going to change overnight, right? It's going to require some intentionality and some labor. So my first answer, and again, I want to acknowledge this is probably not fun for people to hear, but I'm read the books. And there are so many books you could read, so that's overwhelming. I have a page on my website that's literally just deconstruction web resources, right? And it's not the end all be all, but it's some books that I found to be particularly helpful. Brian McLaren's A New Kind of Christianity, to me, it was a really soft, helpful, transitionary book to address the moral conscience of an evangelical Christian confronting the problematic theology. Universal Christ by Richard Rohr, again, to me was another transitionary kind of book, more hitting the spirituality and the ethics behind our theology that I thought he did a great job. You want to get more biblical, Rob Bell and Pete Enns, I think both did great jobs of making complex theological conversations a lot more lower shelf and accessible, but also substantiating their work, in the books. So What is the Bible by Rob Bell, I thought was a really helpful, practical book. The Bible Tells Me So by Pete Enns. Anyway, those are some really easy, helpful, immediate places I would refer people to if they're just starting to ask the questions and look at some of this. The other part I want to answer about that is the reading, doing the work of addressing the ideas themselves is really important. The other thing I would say is this is an emotional journey. So get around some people who are on the journey with you, or at least who are further along than you, who are doing the work too, who are asking the questions too, who have the courage and the audacity enough to say, is this true? Is that right? Are we aware of the impact these beliefs, these practices are having on people? Does that matter to us? Right? People who are talking and thinking that way, get around people like that. And maybe not just once in a while, get around people. So I'm not trying to just shamelessly plug here, but I have a couple of groups specifically dedicated toward hosting space for people who are deconstructing. One of them is just dialoguing. The other one is specifically a book club where we're reading these books I just mentioned and others together. And every week we're chiming in on the last reading from the week and pulling apart the ideas and how did it feel and what are we thinking and what were the aha moments? What did we hate? What, just processing through it together. And the goal is not to end up anywhere in particular. The goal is to be on the journey together and allow for the rational, critical thinking process to have its effect on each individual. And they get to land wherever they want. But the goal is let's decolonize, let's detoxify, let's confront harmful beliefs, right? So I think the other thing I would add to that question, or my answer to that question is get around other people. Don't do this alone. It is terrifying. It's intense. Some beliefs, maybe not that big of a deal, right? But when you get into other things, the afterlife, salvation, Jesus, the resurrection, some of this stuff, the Bible, some of these things are bigger deals. You know what I mean? They're more fundamental building blocks to people's realities. So if you're going to start asking about some of those things and pulling at that thread, which I think you should do, I think ethically you should re-examine some of the things you've been told about those things.
Yes.
Don't do it alone. that's a lot. You know what I mean? And your mental health is going to be impacted by this. So be with people who can simply be human with you. That's how I'm going to answer the first part.
And I got to throw out that there's not just like groups, which your groups I've heard are fantastic. Honestly, what you just described with like the book club and even just going on and having a dialogue, I maybe considering maybe joining up for that too. So, but there are like outings, like Theology Beer Camp just happened a couple weeks ago. There's that one in August. I was talking to Brian Recker, and he said that he
Wild
saw
Goose.
you over there. Wild Goose, yeah. So there are get-togethers that meet up around the country. I'm not sure where Theology Beer Camp is going to end up for this next year, but Wild Goose is in was it Alabama? Was it or I forget.
North Carolina. It wasn't North Carolina.
North Carolina.
Yeah.
I know it's kind of more on the East Coast or something like that. I just couldn't remember where it was. But yeah, there are groups where you can do that, and you can look these groups up. So Wild Goose, the LG Beer Camp. I'm not sure of more than that. I'm sure you might be able to think of more, but
one more I'd mention is the Post Evangelical Collective. I don't know exactly how to plug into that world, but that's another group of people who are anyway. Yeah, I would add that to the list. But yeah,
and I can say it's been very healing for me to be around people. I mean, my journey so far, most of my friends and connections aren't necessarily in the same sphere that I am. They're very much, locked into their way of life, going to church, listening to the preacher. That's their life. They've got their beliefs already set. Their fundamentalisms of their basis of living is already set and stone. And so I don't have too many people. So when I went to Theology Beer Camp, I was like, wow, there's a whole community of people that are asking these questions just like I'm asking. So I can say firsthand that, I love these kind of communities, and I think someone should get plugged in, especially stuff like what you have going on. So
thank you. Yeah, I love that.
Well, that was the last question. I love this conversation. I seriously want to reach out to you again and have a conversation down the road as well, find some other topic or something like that. But, or we could talk about this again. I mean, I feel like you already have more you could probably say. So, but thank you so much for coming on the show. This has just been such a good day for me. So.
Nice. Mark, I'm honored. I appreciate that you're holding space for this. You're asking these questions. This is such important work, and there's so many people who still, need these conversations to be happening publicly. So I love that you're hosting this, and thanks for having me. I'm honored to be part of it.
For sure. All right. Well, I'll talk to you later then.
Okay.
That's it for today's episode of Grub and Grace. I hope you enjoyed our conversation with Mike Maeshiro about advocating and allowing safe spaces for healing for those with religious trauma. I want to give a big thank you to Mike for joining us on this episode, and I will make sure to put his links in the notes. Music is by Fleece Mob, with the song Everything You Need. Graphics are by Root and Branch Creative. Remember to visit our website at grubandgrace.com. That's grubandgrace.com, as well as our socials on Facebook, Instagram, and X.
This week's recipe won't be happening. I have fallen a little behind on updating the recipes on my website, and as much as I want to share my food with you, I found that it was a bit of an ambitious task to take on at this time. So in the future, I hope to start up again, but for now, as it stands, I won't be including that.
Until next time, stay curious, keep an open mind, and celebrate the traditions that bring us all together.